just like to say, thanks for coming out this evening. As a membership organisation, ORF is really keen to get people to join and participate and be part of what we're doing. We have an introductory offer that we run for the first year's membership. It's only a tenner. So if you are not a member of ORF at the moment and would like to be, we'd be delighted to have you. It's an organisation which is a combination of business, individuals, getting together and discussing issues in the energy space. And personally, my wife finds it really useful that I come out and do this because it saves me doing it at home, and saves boring her to death. So I also want to say my thanks to Mike and Adrian for the technical jiggery pokery. We're using equipment that ORF bought as a result of winning the Sustainable Islands Prize, which is an EU prize 18 months or a couple of years ago, where we were awarded a slab of money, and we bought this kit. The idea with this is that we can actually record and stream these events, both record them for later, but also stream them to, say, people on the Isles to save coming in and all the rest of it. So this is one of the things that we've done with it. So our thanks to the Commission for the money that was involved. I'm going to rattle through some of this stuff, but key point being, it's not my document, okay? So if we get to the point you want to shoot me, it's not me, I'm just telling you what's in this thing, so just bear with me. And if somebody wants to act as my second to cover my back, that would be really useful. But seriously, there is an awful lot of good stuff that's in here. So if we can have the slides up, please. Mike, slides. My electrical assistant. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. So the consultation, as they run for about another month or so, and this is very much a members' consultation. The remote's not working. There we go. We're good. Fine. There you go. Before that fails, push the right button. Good tip. Right, write that down somewhere. Okay. So the Scottish Government are planning a bill, and it really seeks to do several things. It's actually planning to ban polluting heating systems. Quite strong language, I think, recognising that oil and gas are polluting heating systems. And it goes a little bit further later on, and it doesn't encourage biomass either. So it's moving principally to electricity in various forms. The idea is that it'll make these changes over a couple of periods. Households, owner-occupied houses, will need to make the changes by 2033, or getting housing up to a particular performance standard by 2033, and rental properties by 2028. And the idea is, within the bill, there are ways in which those costs can be spread over time. The community comment is invited, and it closes in March. OREP is obviously going to be making a response, so we're keen to capture ideas. And I'm going to rattle through this lot because I don't think, so we can get to have a discussion as quickly as we can. Why is it happening? Well, we know we've got some significant climate change problems. That graph in the top right-hand corner is basically the CO2 levels in the atmosphere over my lifetime. And I was born, we had 317 parts per million CO2. We're now 422 parts, as I've looked it up this morning. So we definitely have a carbon dioxide problem. And heating our homes is actually the third largest contributor to emissions in Scotland. And the intention is to make sure that gas and oil systems are actually not used for heating and hot water. The consultation says that change is going to be needed to something like 89% of domestic properties and nearly half of non-domestic, and about half of houses are presently worse than EPC Energy Performance Certificate grade C. However, if you look at the graphics in the report, it actually shows how they believe properties are heated, because this is Scotland as a whole, and the green 3/4 of the circle is main gas. So clearly we are not typical of what they're expecting. So I would suggest, and I don't know if the figures are around, that we are not in a position where the scale of change that they're talking about here is actually what we need to do, because frankly, a lot of houses have already made the change to non-polluting energy system, electric heating in various forms or other, and the housing as it's going in at the moment is pretty much electric. So I think this is less of a contentious issue for us, and I imagine it will be for a number of other communities as well. But in some areas, particularly urban areas, this will be the scale of change that they're talking about. But I don't think that's us entirely. So why are they actually having to legislate? Well, some properties are actually and businesses are actually been making the change already, but the current rate of switching to electric heating is far too slow. And if we carry on at the present rate, it's going to take several hundred years to get to a point where we have got made the change sufficient to actually have an impact. So they recognise that there needs to be some action taken to actually drive change. So the proposals are actually in two main parts. It's firstly the prohibiting of polluting heating systems. And then it's also about making sure that homes meet a reasonable minimum energy efficiency standard. Now, there's a little bit that comes in a bit later on, and that is that if you have already got a non-polluting heating system, you don't have to worry too much about the energy performance side of things. So if you've already got a green heating system, then they're not pushing you towards improving your house. Now, clearly there's an incentive to do so. You're stupidly throwing money away. But the point is there are some cutouts in some of this lot. And the point is this will apply to both owner-occupied and rented properties. At the bottom, the graph showing the scale of what's going on in terms of privately rented and social rented. Between them are 38% of housing stock. And one of the issues I can see coming here is that those are often the properties in which people are in the greatest risk of fuel poverty. And so quite sensibly, they are targeting the rental sector to have to get its act together sooner than the private ownership properties. Seems to make sense to me. That's an unusual balance, but I think it seems to make sense. So this consultation is actually seeking views on how to make new laws about the whole idea of energy efficiency and the changes. And they recognise this is a big ask, particularly at times when we're at financial strictures. This is a difficult time to do it. And the proposals are really designed to have a just transition, so it's affordable and fair and feasible. So, and there are several bits in the documentation which I think show a degree of compassion about what they're trying to achieve. So looking at the heat side of things particularly, and one of the ways in which this can be implemented, it's in part about the fact that there are over 100,000 house sales in Scotland last year. And at the point of sale, you already have to produce an energy performance certificate. So there is a mechanism by which people will have to declare the state of their house before they sell it on. And that actually already shows the main heating system in the home. The idea is that prospective buyers can actually then see what they're buying into. And one of the arguments is that, in fact, that would allow prospective buyers to, frankly, haggle over the price and to make sure that they know what they're buying into. And possibly it may actually be a trigger for the people selling the house to want to get the house up to standard before they sell it. One way or the other, there's going to be a bit of pushing and shoving on that interface. You can see how that works. But what's actually going to happen and what's actually going to stop is this whole issue of using polluting heating systems. And that's got to stop in rented accommodation by 2029. It actually says end of 2028, but I'll put 29 there because it was easier. And it also shows that rented accommodation has got to be done 5 years earlier. Now, so once again, pointing out that if you're already in rented accommodation that's on electric heating, the performance side of things, you don't have to change the energy performance necessarily. So what are the alternatives to polluting heating systems? Well, they're principally the ones that we are used to seeing: air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, district heating networks, which we are not seeing much of, and then just general electric heating in one way or another. So I don't think it's really a great shock to most people that that's really what most people are putting in at the moment. So oil is fairly rare. And if people have got some examples of that, see Michael here and Alistair and Stephen, if you've got any input about what is going on, it'd be really useful to put this into the consultation in a factual state. The last time I put an oil boiler was St Magnus Cathedral, but that was a good reason why. Simon, go.
I thought that my going on 24.5 and the anything that I put them for that's 29. It might all be that half of it.
I think that is.
Well, you don't know what you have then.
Yeah, you might be right. So I'll double check that, Simon. So thank you. So so the reason is I've pulled the slides that they've used and I've then hacked them about to make them slightly more readable. But that's one that I put in. So it's possible I've got that one slightly twisted. So that if that is actually about, okay, we'll check that. The other point is that because of this 100,000 homes that change hands every year, there's also a question in here about if you buy a house, you will be compelled to make sure that it's either up to an energy standard or he's not using it in a particular polluting energy system within a certain period. And they're asking questions about whether people should be given 2 years grace or 5 years grace in the whole thing. So there is a point where some degree of compulsion is going to take place. You're right there, Simon. Was that? So what you got, Robert? Go on.
Very well. What's the
Fine. So it says non-domestics by 2045, but there is a push for this in it. Okay, well, we don't. Fine. So that's what. So there's some quite interesting bits of. Sorry, Simon. Can we do this afterwards? So there's some quite interesting bits of compulsion that are creeping in around the edge of this, and I think, frankly, it's necessary because we've got to get on with this, and we can't all be nice about it all the time. So the other side of things that's also covered in the consultations about heat networks. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but there aren't any heat networks in Orkney at the moment, although we did try one in the past. But through the LHES program that's coming in, the local heat energy efficiency strategy out there, that there are proposed, that it's being considered, the practicalities.
I wouldn't really up there. What is it that? But we really apply afterwards, so I think identify a real reading by the partner.
Yeah. Okay. So and there seems to be more encouragement to put in district heating and heat networks. It's something that's increasing by the Scottish Government now, and we might see that sort of thing start to become manifest. So, and there's work, the work to look at the possibilities in certain areas that's going on at the moment. And if a heat network is put in, the idea is that households will actually be asked to join that network. And there'll be no compulsion to join that network. But if a network is put in, you'll be asked to join. If you don't join, you'll be pushed to have to change your heating system to a low energy system anyway. So the act of putting a heat network in will actually trigger activity. Join it or change. What you won't have is the opportunity to ignore it. So I think that's a system that I think they used in Denmark to an extent, where heat networks were put in and people were said, you can join if you want, but if you don't want to join, you're going to pay for it anyway. And there was a degree of nudging and encouragement. So I think this is quite interesting. And whether this survives drafting in the bill, we'll see. But it may not be something that's big here. There are probably opportunities, but we'll see how this goes. So looking at the energy efficiency side of things as well, obviously we know it's sort of we know how this works. The energy obviously reduces the energy efficiency reduces the heating requirements of hot water and heat and reduces bills and also the greenhouse emissions. And it also reduces the size of heating equipment, i.e. you can have smaller heat pumps if you're in well-insulated houses, and also clearly reduces fuel poverty. The less fuel you buy, whatever price, the more money you've still got. And therefore that helps the poverty aspect. And so it is all in the right sort of direction. So OREF is firmly committed to energy efficiency and the preferential use of renewables. It's written right into the middle of our objectives. So this makes absolute sense. The Scottish Government is asking for a couple of views on a couple of ways of actually making this work. So how should improving energy efficiency actually be driven? And they're suggesting one or two ways, either by pushing people towards installing a list of what they're referring to, or a series of particular measures, which I'll talk about in a second, which is basically insulation in various forms and smart controls. Or alternatively, a means by which you can actually show your house is reaching an energy efficiency of equivalent of C. And basically what that's come down to a demonstration of how much energy you use per square metre of house. So there is a proposal that if you can demonstrate you're at those energy consumption levels, then they're deemed to be at C as I read it, in which case you may not need to do anything. But if you can't do something, you're going to be nudged towards it. Now, the question is how that nudging takes place and what support is given as part of that will be obviously key to how take-up happens. But looking at those two ways of doing it, oops, wrong way. The energy efficiency, the list of measures that they're talking about, cavity wall, 270 mil. So what's that? 10 inches in old money. Draft proofing, heating controls, hot water lagging, and suspended floor insulation. Once again, none of those things are exactly rocket science, and frankly, most of those have a degree of practicality, and we'll come on to the point in a minute. And the point is, this will be needed in private rented property by the end of 2028, or privately owned houses by the end of 2033, unless the property is already using a non-polluting system. So if you're already using electric, then you're okay. Simon, go.
Start with the executive we have the non-applied private revenue on the basis that allow restoration in non-energy.
Say that again.
The exemption from the efficiency standard if you have a clean heating system will be utilized by the not private rentals.
I'll take your word for that. Yep. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Simon. Good. So the point is, once again, I suggest that this is not going to be too much of a threat for a lot of what's going on in Orkney because we're already on the non-polluting heating systems. However, some of those things will be a challenge in some locations, so particularly the wall insulation. And I think we've got input and insight into the practicalities and impracticalities of some of the insulation techniques that have been used historically. And it would be useful to feed this in to say, these are some of the challenges we may have. It's also interesting that public buildings are also going to be pushed into not using polluting heating systems by 2038. So you have to take the boilers back out of St Magnus. You got 14 years of use out of there. But there's a separate push on the public sector. I think there's got to be a little bit careful with the definition of public sector in that one because it says public sector owned buildings. It doesn't say public sector used buildings. So if the public sector externalised its buildings to a different organisation, would that still count? So we've got to be careful. There isn't a means to circumvent that. You going to chip in there? No. Heaven forbid. I've only ever known you circumvent things for the better, so that's all right. We're good with that. So this is one of the options, and the other one was about the energy performance certificates. If you can have your house, so you will have your house assessed for an energy performance certificate if you sell it or putting it on the market. And I think the EPC lasts for 10 years technically. But say you can have your house, and I can't work out whether you actually have to have it assessed as an EPC, or whether you can actually just demonstrate it by the energy that you're actually using. I understand that you can have a demonstration. I would suggest there are some opportunities to make some inputs to the EPC side of things, because that's quite clunky. And the Scottish Government is overhauling the EPC system at the moment. That was a consultation earlier in the year, which I completely missed. But I'm not quite sure where the EPC certificates are heading, but there are definitely some clunky bits in there that could do with being improved. It says, say the government are actually reforming them, so we're trying to find out exactly where they've got to on that. So, and then government says all the nice soft bits as well, which is interesting. So they're talking about introducing flexibility in the implementation of these regulations, because, as they say, really the complexity of housing stock in individual circumstances. So once again, it would be useful to surface Orkney's experience in that. So solid walls, or stone built, or whatever we've got, to show how big an issue this is. Personal expectation is that I think it's not as big an issue. We can all think of stone built buildings, but actually most of us don't live in them. So I would suggest it would be useful if we could sort of scope some of that to show the scale of that. There are a number of people who do live in them. How representative of that, even in this community? How representative is that of people even in this community? They also propose giving some extra time to people, for example, where a clean heating system isn't available at present. I'm not exactly sure what they're meaning there on that one at the moment. So we'll see if there's some great, I don't know, nuclear fusion in a box is coming up later. Maybe you don't have to do it, maybe not. And also giving some more time if you are using biomass, which is interesting, but I don't think it necessarily specifies exactly what that is at the moment. They're also considering time when complex solutions are needed, particularly with their tenements and flats. One of the pieces I'm going to suggest we put in the response is that there's a particular issue with flats and tenements with Scots property law, which is that if you're in a shared building, you jointly and severally own the fabric of the building. You can only make a change to that if all tenants consent to it. So if you have a period or have a location where one of the tenants is silent on it, be it an absentee landlord or somebody who just doesn't answer their mail, technically you can't intervene in the property, and it feels as though there's going to need to be some degree of democratic approach to that, which means that if the majority say yes, we can do something, then we ought to be able to get on with it. So I suggest there's probably some property law that's going to need a bit of a tweak, because otherwise you'll find one person will hold up the change to an entire block, which seems counterproductive. And they also say they're going to be flexible if there are different situations based on different building characteristics or unique circumstances. Once again, we may have something that we can share from an Orkney experience, given the age of some of the property here. The other sort of sop in the whole thing is about managing the costs, and they recognise that it could be expensive, and working out how they can limit the cost of this. And there's quite a complicated process here, which I have no intention of going through because it's very complicated. But broadly speaking, there are a series of ways in which you can either have a flat rate or a variable tariff, and a variety of pieces. And they want views on whether a cost cap is needed. And there are different ways of calculating it. If somebody wants to write something about that, please do. It does my head in, so I wasn't going to bother. But there are a couple of fundamentals in here. It does talk about things like, should they give first-time buyers an exemption from this? Personally, I would suggest that's not a good idea, because the first-time buyers, by definition, when we all bought our first property, we were quite stretched. And actually, burning a lot of fuel because you're living in a cold, leaky house is not a great idea. It might be better to be able to capitalise those costs of altering the house and spread that out on the mortgage over a period of time and have the benefits from the heating improvements at the start, rather than exempting them and having young people living in cold, freezing houses. Surely we've got to get on top of this. So I'm not convinced the first-time buyer exemption makes sense, but we need a mechanism by which they can afford to stay in the property. And some deferral of cost might be a better way of dealing with that. And so the general so onto the consultation questions themselves, there are, I think, half a dozen of them, 5 actually. So they want to know what people think of the idea to prohibit polluting heating systems in all buildings after 2045. They want to understand what we think about introducing a minimum efficiency standard to be met by occupied houses by the end of 2033. and introduce the minimum by 2028, and require change following the sale of a property, which I think is quite contentious. And then finally, requiring buildings within a heat network zone to actually join the zone or be triggered into action if the zone is created one way or another. I find there's a lot of catch-all about, do you have questions about the proposals and all the rest of it? So what I've got is a couple of slides to finish off, which is really about the position that was suggesting OREF is going to take in a general position. If I push the right button? Yes, general position. So it was supportive of the intent to reduce fuel because of the reduction in CO2 and the ability to influence fuel poverty by reducing the requirement for fuel. That seems to entirely fit with what the OREF does on a routine basis, and that seems to be a good idea. But I think it's reasonable to say we've got some concern about the application in Orkney and the difference that Orkney will have compared with the central belt of like no gas and the preponderance of solid build and stuff like that. Other people have their own different issues, so we're not big on tenements for argument's sake. So I think we'll be saying that pace is needed. So I think the aggressive timetables make sense because we've got to get on with this. If we don't get on with this, it's going to bloody kill us. So getting on with this is important. And although it's a pain, the alternative is worse. And the idea that if a heat network is created, nudging people towards it is going to be important. That's a behavioural change. If we were Danish, we'd be used to having a heat network. Because we're Scottish, we think it's a bit unusual. So we need to recognise there's a cultural change that's best affected by a bit of a nudge. I'm going to suggest that the financial penalties they're talking about, which is if you don't comply, there'll be sort of bandings or fines and bits and pieces. That could actually be a bit more constructive. Whereas if we got people to comply, some sort of council tax discount would be a better way than penalising people if they fail to do something. So pull people towards it rather than push them, I would suggest psychologically is a better way of making it work. Now, from a council point of view, the risk there is that obviously there's a reduction in council receipts because of the fact that people are complying and therefore they're in a lower band. But I would suggest the net effect is that the overall council tax bill would reduce, and effectively we'd have to raise the council tax for everybody. But the point is that people who are not complying, their vote raised more than everybody else. So the total take should be the same. But we should be looking to differentiate between people compliant and non-compliant. And the idea about creating the opportunity to capitalise the cost of change in some way. To some extent, that was really what was proposed by the government with the green mortgages. What was it called? Was it a green mortgage? It was green. No, was it? What's Green Deal? Green Deal. Yeah. So where you could make changes to property and actually add that onto your mortgage costs to spread it out. So I suggest that's still a good idea, even though it didn't take off the first time round. And then finally, to actually comment on the fact the EPC system is flawed as it stands at the moment. It's not necessarily a good indication of comfort. It's a numerical system, and it's fairly incomplete and not very well executed, it seems. And we know there are errors in it. A couple of other specific points we're going to make. One, the point about flats. Flats will be hard to deal with if legislation is left as it is about the ownership of the outside of the property. Interestingly, it sort of excludes retail, and it doesn't set energy performance standards for retail. I would suggest this is a good opportunity for us to put the boot in about the fact that it doesn't seem a lot of sense when you walk down the high street, you get assaulted by gales of hot air coming out of shops when they can't be bothered to shut the door. So frankly, something about changing some retail behaviours, which is if the heating's on, the door's shut. If you can't work out how a door goes, I'm not sure you're going to manage the chip and pin. So anyway, a bit about public sector buildings are going to be driven faster than housing, which I think makes sense because they're a good way of making it work but I think we need to be careful about the definition of public sector buildings to make sure there isn't evasion. I don't know if I keep looking at Alistair when I'd say evasion. That's not fair, is it? Um, and also, I would suggest that we're going to need to make sure that all parts of the public sector are on board with this, because there are changes coming within the planning space, and some of the changes here will need building regulation control, and we've got to make sure that that's as streamlined as possible. I'm certainly hearing some stories about it not being as streamlined as possible, and it feels as though there are some improvements. So we need to make sure the whole system is groomed so that things can go through it quickly and as smoothly and as frictionlessly as possible. And there's also a piece about, I suggest we make some comment about public finance initiative contracts. So a case in point, say what we've got with the Balfour, where the particular contract that was set for that meant that it's a design, build and operate facility. And so Morrison's built it, operate it and rent it back to the NHS Orkney. However, the costs for fuel are a pass-through cost. So the costs for fuel are simply passed through to the client. There is no incentive for the builder to be efficient in the building that's constructed. And that's a daft idea. And so, and I don't, was that the same with the schools? Yeah.
Huge, key losing point of that was the key.
Yeah.
No,
but they need to suggest that there needs to be a mechanism by which there's joint pain and gain about to encourage them. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of things that
Okay.
was
But I suggest that the best way to incentivize energy efficiency is actually to have the contractor feeling some of the benefit or pain. Yeah. So
that's nice. They're already liking to buy contract.
but they might change the next one they issue. So I think this is a thing for the Scottish Futures Trust, particularly, to be on board with making sure that sort of behaviour stops. So that's where we are. That's what I know. Simon has read a lot. You've been doing your homework well, and Simon, glad you're here, mate. So it really is a case of chucking it open to the floor if there are particular points that